There are names that we often carry in silence, whether we are aware of it or not, and when we listen closely, we can hear their echoes coming from the roots of the soil. I know that's a little bit dramatic, but in this video, I have a point to prove with that. And I'm going to be talking a little more on Indigenous family connections. And I'm going to try my best not to say too much because there are people out here who be stealing other people's ancestry just to get into tribes. And that's, it's a little bit creepy. So a few days ago, I had received a few messages from one of my cousins, and this cousin in my family, she is really deep into the Indigenous American community. So whenever she sends me messages, I always look forward to seeing it because she always has something great to share. So what she sent me was 3 articles from nativeamerican.wordpress.com. And in these articles, it's spoken about the Anderson and the Bass family. It's either Bass or Bass. I am not good with pronouncing certain family names, but I'm gonna just say Bass for now. My apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But these articles was based on the Andersons and Bass family. And what caught me the most was the fact that we're actually connected to the Anderson and Bass family. And in this article, it's spoken a lot about who was connected to who, the Native American roots, so on and so forth, and them being based in Virginia in like the upper North Carolina area. Now, this article said this person written a lot, and I respect whoever written this article because they're helping keeping the Native American families' names alive. However, there was 2 things that stood out to me, and I felt like it was really important to share, so I'm gonna talk about it in this video. So the 2 things that stood out to me was, one, the person doesn't know where the Andersons that stayed in Virginia, which I'm gonna talk about a little bit, where they are today, and 2, the whole don't know whether they were part African or not. So, starting off with the Anderson family, the Andersons were originally slaves to this guy named John. And John, he was born in 1666 and passed away in 1712. So, they were slaves. And when he passed away, he did not leave his property to his family, he left his property to the slaves, and his request was to free them and give them the land. And when that happened, it pissed all the white people off. So there was back and forth between the Andersons and these white folks. And there were people like forcing them to like leave and move. Some moved down to North Carolina and others had stayed in Virginia. So it was like a back and forth with that. Now, the thing that was really interesting to me was the person who written this article, and I respect what they did. What stood out to me was how they're not sure whether the Andersons were part African. They know that they are Indigenous American because of the Andersons' connections with the Bass family, which were a part of the Nanseman tribe. Listen, I'm not good with names, but they are connected to that tribe, and they also had connections with this Indian trader named William. So there was a bunch of indigenous connections with the Andersons and other Indigenous Americans in the area. But because they were slaves, it's like they're making an assumption that they most probably was part African, but they don't know for sure. They don't even know how John acquired the slaves, how he even got them. But just based off of them being slaves, it's like we're kind of certain that they were part African, but we don't know yet. So when it comes to that, I've been told that some, see, when you go back in time, it gets very murky. So I've heard stories that there were slaves that were actually Indigenous American. So it's like the other way around. Instead of the whole African slave trade, and I'm not saying that it didn't happen, I'm not saying that. I do feel like it was exaggerated though. Um, but besides from that African slave trade, a lot of Indigenous Americans were captured and put into slavery. So that's another side of history that you barely hear about. So it's like, to me, based off of my intuition, because we're all going off of assumptions, I feel like the Andersons were just Indigenous American who were captured. And if there's no proof of them being African, but there's proof of them having connections with the Indigenous American and intermingling with them, for me, it's safe to say that they were just straight up Indigenous American. And I think that's an issue with this community. Is like, because there were people who were slaves back in the day, it has to be linked to African when it that's no one has strong evidence of that. So with that being said, it is really important for us to reclaim and do research on who our family were, because when you don't know who you are, that is a dangerous path to walk, because you don't know what's being pulled underneath your eyes. For instance, a lot of us walk through plazas, parking lots, malls, certain areas that has a lot of history underneath that we don't even know about. Like, for an example, there are some plazas out here that I know about where I live that is built on top of graves that were a part of so-called Black communities. And it's like they build on top of our graveyards and then just slap a name years later, name the street after this families whose ancestors rest in peace underneath the plazas. Certain schools out here that I've heard about was built on top of our ancestors' graves. And there's other things that go on that just get swept underneath the rug, and we don't know about it because a lot of us don't feel connected to the land, because we've been programmed to think that our ancestors come from overseas. And I've noticed that in my community, there are people who do not care about the land out here because they go by the programming of, my people were brought over here, this ain't even my land, blah, 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 blah. And I watch them litter all over the place and treat this land very disrespectful. And unless you are spiritually connected, which I've spoken about in the beginning, where you can hear their echoes coming from the roots of the soil, unless you are spiritually connected, you really have no clue. So I'm going to give an example with that. So when it comes to my Indigenous American ancestors and where I'm from, so New York, New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, I think even Alabama. That I gotta do a little bit more research with that. But I know mostly of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, and Georgia. I didn't really know too much about Virginia, although I do know that my mother's side and my father's side goes back to that area. However, I was overlooking Virginia a lot during my journey of researching. And I remember over a year ago, me and my boyfriend had visit his friend who owns a food restaurant in Virginia. I think it's called, I keep getting it mixed up. It's either called Hot Chicken Kitchen or Hot Kitchen Chicken. One of those. If you're in that area, you probably know because his food is the bomb. Go check it out. But anyway, we went to go visit his friend, and we was in Virginia for like a couple of days. And I remember we did some zip lining at a place called Go Ape. And this was my first time in Virginia. The whole time that I was there, it felt like I was home. Never been to Virginia before, but it felt like as if my house was right down the street. And it kind of was like, you know how when people say when you take your first step in Africa, when you get off the plane, it feels like you're back home. Well, I got that experience in Virginia, and I just remember feeling very like, I'm like, what is this? It feels like as if the trees are trying to tell me something. I know, mad woo woo, but just hear me out. And I remember my boyfriend's friend was saying like where we was at. The park had like a unique name. So he was like, I wonder if Native Americans used to live here because of the name, blah 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, yeah, but in my head, I was like, no, seriously though, because I really feel a connection. But I wasn't gonna talk about that to him because my boyfriend's friend is Catholic, so I wasn't gonna get all spiritual with that. But the point was that I really felt a connection to Virginia, which was the state that I overlooked a lot on my journey. So ever since that experience, I started doing a little bit more research on Virginia and just started paying a little more attention to that area because of the connection that I felt. And then months later, that's when I received a bunch of documents showing that I'm connected to tribes like the Nanseman tribe, Pamunkey tribe, the Powhatan tribe. If I'm pronouncing that name right, my apologies, but my cousin had sent me so many documents showing all these connections and how I'm like a descendant of one of the chiefs that were out there. And yeah, so saying all of that, unless you're spiritually connected, it's kind of like hard to even make that connection with the land out here because a lot of us were programmed to believe that we came from overseas. So with that being said, to answer the person who had written this article, if they ever was to come across this video, what happened to the Andersons that stayed in Virginia? Well, based on my side, because I can only speak from my side, a lot of the Andersons, which was spoken about in the article, a lot of the Andersons had mixed in with a lot of the native tribes and the surrounding areas in Virginia and also in North Carolina. So on my side of the family, the Andersons had mixed with the Tuscaroras. I know we have a connection to the Locklear family in the Lumbee tribe. Also, they had mixed with the Lenape, which is another thing that I came across this past week. So ever since I was little, I always heard stories from my grandpa that we were Ramapo Indian. However, it was really hard for me to like find evidence of that, which even though I did believe what my grandfather said. So I am not discrediting the elders, the ancestors, just because I don't know. I was born later, so what do I know? But as far as trying to reclaim that back in today's times, you do need evidence. But I had came across the connections with the Andersons and the Ramapos. So there's this last name in the Ramapo tribe that are also my mom's cousins, which is the man, another name that I'm mispronouncing. It's just the way that it's spelled with two N's. But the Man family. Um, my family shares a connection with them, and our similar ancestors is Victoria Anderson, um, who was mixed with the Virginia Indians and the Tuscaroras, and another ancestor that we're connected to is Don Newcombe. And for those who know, and for those who don't know, Don Newcombe had played on the Negro lead back in the day with Jackie Robinson. He was cool with Babe Ruth and all that. So he's from that time. Um, so yeah, we share connections with those elders and ancestors. Other groups that the Andersons had mixed with on my side is the people from Barbados. So my ancestor, Miss Victoria Newcombe, she had married a man from Barbados. And even though I've heard stories of indigenous people being shipped to Barbados, I don't know if this side is connected to that, but I do know how the Newcombe started. So what had happened was there was this English man who, with the last name Newcombe, he had went to Barbados to start a sugar plantation. And while he was out there, he fell in love with a Honduran woman and they got married. And I guess he forgot all about that sugar plantation because when his sister had went out to Barbados to visit him, and when she saw what he done, she got upset and went back to England. So those are like my great ancestors. So there's a connection with the English and the Hondurans. I don't know about the indigenous people that were brought to Barbados, but that's all I know so far. Um, Later on, they moved out to New York, and that's where my great grandfather and her met. So there's that, and there's another connection with the Italians. So when Miss Victoria Newcombe and her man had children, one of their sons had married a woman who was part Lenape and part Italian. So there's Italian in the mix. So listen, all of that had happened way before my time. A lot of mixing was going on. But that's the story. And it's really important to really connect with that side because when you don't know who you are, people will start telling you who you are. And you don't want that. Like, I get told that I'm so many different things on a daily basis. If I didn't know who I was, I probably would have thought I was Dominican or something because people always assume I'm Dominican or Brazilian, and the people from India think I'm like a quarter of them. So, like, if it wasn't for me doing my research, people would just throw all this stuff on me and the whole African slave trade. Um, so yeah, it's really important to reconnect with your roots. Another example, back to my ancestor Don Newcombe, even though he is indigenous or he was Indigenous American and Caribbean, they have him labeled as African American. So when we don't know who we are, we don't reclaim the names of our ancestors, it's just going to keep getting buried and buried, and more things are going to be swept up under the rug, and we will have no clue. Other names that I want to mention, but I gotta be careful doing this because there are people out here who are stealing people's identities and claiming it as their own just so they can get into indigenous tribes, which is really creepy. I've heard stories of that, so I'm trying to be really careful here. But other last names that I know of, that at least I'm connected to, is, from the top of my head, from what I can remember, because there's a lot of last names. When you go back in time, it's like the tree just expands more and more. But the Howard family, a Walker family, the Walkers they have an interesting past, because the Walkers that came out here, they had beef with the Cherokees, and the Cherokees were basically kicking their ass. So, but later on, they intermingled all the Virginia area. So the Howard, the Walker, the Stephen or Stephens, depending on which document you're looking at, because sometimes they spell it Stephen or Stephen. Um, Jackson, Moore, Moody. Those are the Jersey areas of my family. What else? Um, the Browns of Maryland slash Delaware, uh, Lipsy, Georgia. Um, oh my gosh, so many last names. Um, Nance, Flowers, McCoy. Um, and I'm pretty sure there's others that I keep. The Skyfields, another last name that I am mispronouncing, but so many of us had intermingled with each other. So, yeah. So, with that being said, if you don't know what your roots are, if you don't know who your ancestors are, that's okay, because we all been reprogrammed. As long as you're doing the research, you are on the right path. So, as long as you're doing that, plus asking questions, eventually you will break that wall, because there is information out there. You just got to be dedicated and have patience. Patience is really key going down this ancestry journey, like for real, for real. So with that being said, that's it for this video.